Hey guys, my name is Shanice Anderson, and so for this week's discussion post, we're supposed to talk about why the concept of Western civilization is important. I think it's important today more than ever because there's so much access to information and there's so many conversations happening, and one of the connecting factors is the idea of the West. However, based on this week's readings and what we've kind of known for a long time, is that the West does not really have a strict definition. So contextually, the West could mean language, it could be Western religions, it could be anything political, it could be racial, geographical, social, musical, legal, military, art. It could represent so many different things, yet we keep having these conversations about the West. And I would argue that a lot of our conflict stems from the fact that there is no strict definition, which means that a lot of times when we're talking to one another, my idea of the West may not be your idea of the West. And so a lot of those conversations end up being stalled because there's no set definition. I'll also say that the West has for a very long time been sort of an other checkbox where things, like I said, art, music, movies, religions, beliefs, political systems, you name it, have just been put there if they don't match a particular, more established culture. And while it's okay to see the West as a mix, simply chucking stuff into another box doesn't really allow for a further, deeper study of that concept. And it does not allow for intelligent conversation to happen. Again, you can think about it as something just being kind of tossed away. And what's happened is that so many people have now come out of the West or identify with the West that those things that have been chucked into those boxes are actually quite valuable. And so to have them sort of be othered is now causing a problem. We know that, by human nature, feelings get involved in just about every aspect of our lives. And so I think a lot of the difficulties in having conversations stem from not exploring those other things that are considered Western, yet those things are still attached to people who come from the West, again, however you define that. So I think there are two options here if you really look at it. There may be more, but there were two that really came to me as I read through this week's passages. And the first is that we need to either create a finite definition of the West, and so that would involve a lot of historical research. And there are some pros and cons to that. One of the pros would be that we would have a starting point and an established definition of the West so that when these dialogues happen, everybody starts at the same point and has the same level of understanding. With that, you have to understand that access to this level of information is not necessarily granted to everyone. And when we look at concepts such as the West, a lot of us who have grown up in the West understand, the foundations of things like democracy or even our military strategy to be American Western things. And so I couldn't imagine a kindergartner going nearly as far back historically as we just did for these readings this week. And so then you kind of deal with the complexity of establishing a starting point. Even as I was going through this week's readings, Birkenberger, Appiah, I hope I'm saying that correctly, and Royal, they all begin their stories and definitions of the West with either Greek or Roman origins, but they kind of deviate. And even, they're not the same, even though they are established historians. And so again, I think it's going to be very difficult to come up with a definition of the West from a historical standpoint. And so I think the second option might be a little bit better. And the second option I would say would be to accept the eclectic nature of the West and figure out how to engage in both academic and casual conversation about the West in its varying contexts. And so you could ask a question, at the beginning of a conversation where the West comes up. What do you mean by the West? Are we talking artistically? Are we talking legally? Are we talking politically? Are we talking racially? What do you mean by the West? And then, getting that other person's definition so that way you have some sort of starting point for the conversation that may not be the same as the other person's, but at least you understand where they're coming from. I think this is especially true when the West is used in a negative context, which it often, that happens a lot. It kind of stuck out to me when I read Berzer's old white men quote at the end of his reading, or at the end of his writing, where he said, in fact, the old white men that you are talking about are the ones that are responsible for your liberty and freedom. And what he meant was that he was talking about the old Greek and Roman white men. However, if you grew up with an American education like me, you know those old white men to be Thomas Jefferson and other figures in that time period who did do wrongdoings amongst my people or to my people. And so those two would take on a completely different definition of the old white men. However, that term is still used as an umbrella term. So again, establishing context for those terms is definitely helpful. And whether that's old white men or Western, I think there's some benefit in both of those. And other than that, I think, these readings this week pretty much let me know that I don't know a whole lot about the concept of the West, or not nearly as much as I thought I did. But it's going to allow me to kind of look at this idea of the West from all these different contexts that I've brought forth, and then really try to understand that there are two sides to every coin. I know that the West is not all bad. Coming up as a millennial, during 9/11, when the West was thrown out there in such a negative context, it was hard for me for the longest time to see the West as a good thing. And so I think this course is going to be very valuable to me in helping me understand, again, the two sides to every coin theory that was presented in several of the readings from this week. And really looking at how to have proper discourse about this concept of the West.